We've looked at the issue of company structure, of there being different departments within the company who must work together to achieve company strategy. So strategy implementation is implementation of activities by various departments within the company. Now, there is a question of how do you allocate, how does the company's senior management allocate resources to various departments to ensure that those departments in turn achieve their operational objectives and thus help the company achieve its strategic objective. This allocation of resources, there are a couple of very important factors which impact this process of resource allocation. One of these factors is the extent of central direction in that particular company. There are different kinds of companies. There are companies where the central direction is high, and there are companies where the central direction is low. Central direction is sometimes high because the company is an entrepreneurial company, and that typical change that takes place after some decades. See, every company when it starts is an entrepreneurial company. Most companies when they start are entrepreneurial companies. But after a few decades, what happens is that entrepreneurial company slowly transforms itself into a mature organization. However, there are some entrepreneurial companies that remain entrepreneurial even after several decades. Okay? Now, such companies have strong central direction, or they may be companies where the shareholding is very narrow, and one promoter has maybe 70 or 80% of the shareholding of the company. Here again, central direction is likely to be very high. Sometimes you could have companies which, for purely historical reasons, in other words, the first CEO of that company may have been a very charismatic leader. Now, this person may have assumed a lot of powers and taken on a lot of responsibilities which other people in the company voluntarily gave to him because he was charismatic. Because of this history, the company has a history of strong central direction. So there could be several ways in which companies have strong central direction, but that is an important factor which affects resource allocation. Okay, now let's look at the second factor which affects resource allocation, and this is change. If the company is in a market which is a very traditional market, a market which has seen little change, a market where the competitors have not changed, where the consumers have not changed, where the suppliers have not changed, a market where technology has not changed, where the kinds of processes that operate, the business processes have not changed, right? If it's a traditional market such as this, then that's one kind of scenario. Okay? On the other hand, you could have a scenario where change is rapid. A lot of new customers have come into the market, new suppliers have come in, new competitors have come in, perhaps overseas competitors have come in with entirely new ways of working, business models have changed. So there's been tremendous amount of change in that particular market. This is another possibility. So this change, this factor change, you could either have a low degree of change or a high degree of change. In the same way, the central direction could either be low or high. Now let's see how these two factors interact with each other. Now if the central direction of that particular company is low, and if in that particular industry the change in that industry is low, okay, both these are low, then typically allocation of resources by central leadership to different departments is a question of bargaining. Some department head may be a better bargainer, right? He may negotiate better with his superiors at the corporate level, and he may be able to get more resources for himself. Alternatively, the central planner may insist that every department must come up with an agreed method of allocation of resources, and then there could be a discussion with various departments. But that also ultimately comes down to a question of bargaining. It depends upon the power of that central planner vis-a-vis the power of that department head. So if both the central direction is low and the change in that industry is low, the change element is low, then bargaining is the way in which resources are allocated between departments. Now let's look at a situation where the central direction is low. For historical reasons, that company has had low central direction, but the market in which that company operates now sees very high rate of change. So central direction low, but rate of change is high. Now in this case, what happens is that it's a question of competition between departments for allocation of resources. It's not bargaining, it's a question of competition, right? That is, departments have to convince the central planner that their functioning will impact corporate objectives more than the functioning of another department. So department heads have to really compete amongst themselves for resources. This is another scenario. Now let's look at central direction being low, being high, central direction being high, and the change being low. That is, central power in that company is high, but the company is in an industry where the change has been low. Now in such an event, what happens is that typically there is planners go by means of a formula. Allocation is by means of a formula. They would say that what we have allocated to every department is increased by 5% or it's increased by 10%. On the other hand, if there is a resource crunch at the central level. The central planner may say that allocations to every department is reduced by 10%. It's just allocations across the board decided by the central planner, because central direction is high and change in that industry is low. So what applied last year is good enough for this year. Therefore, the proportion between departments does not need to change. Okay, now let's look at the fourth scenario, where the central direction is high. The central direction in that company is high, but the company is in an industry where there is high rate of change. Okay, in this case, unlike in the earlier case where because central direction was low, it was department heads who competed amongst themselves. But in this case, central direction is high, and therefore it's the planners who will impose priorities on departments. So allocation of resources between departments will vary from scenario to scenario depending upon the interaction of these two factors. Okay, let's go back to the video and have a look at what the gentleman says about resource allocation.
When you drill down into the blocking and tackling of strategy implementation, you need to work through all of these sorts of activities. Programs are initiated to address strategic objectives. Be sure to include a time frame for implementation. Some initiatives will be short-term and others long-term. Consider the interplay between the initiatives. Some will be complementary and others will be competing for the same resources. So identifying these conflicts up front is necessary, and they need to be resolved before you can actually get to the implementation of strategy. The goal of programming is to ensure that all the major strategic initiatives are adequately planned.